Welcome to CharityVillage Connects. I'm Mary Barrell. The Trump administration's sudden elimination of U.S. aid funding has created a global aid crisis and a massive funding void estimated at over $63 billion, which threatens essential programs in health, education, food security, and disaster relief worldwide. Canadian organizations are facing increased demand to fill the gap, exacerbated by the loss of funding for joint programs. Canadian nonprofits are troubleshooting ways to continue their support and urging the Canadian government to increase its foreign aid contributions to meet urgent global needs. Joining us to discuss these critical problems and potential ways forward, please welcome Kate Higgins, CEO of Cooperation Canada. A network of more than 100 Canadian organizations, Cooperation Canada strengthens Canada's global impact by convening leaders, shaping policy, and equipping organizations with the tools and expertise for impact. Before joining Cooperation Canada, Kate worked as the Deputy Executive Director of Oxfam Canada and has also worked in senior strategic and policy roles at Civicus, a global alliance of civil society organizations, and at the North-South Institute and the Overseas Development Institute. Welcome to the podcast, Kate.
Welcome. Very nice to see you, Mary. How are you?
I'm well, thank you. And I'm really appreciative you took the time to be able to speak to us about these really important matters. In a recent statement, you said that the U.S. aid pause is already having catastrophic consequences, including food crises and vanishing health services. Can you share a concrete story or at least an insight from one of Cooperation Canada's member organizations that illustrate how these cuts are affecting lives on the ground?
Absolutely. These cuts were drastic. They were abrupt. They were unexpected at such a fast and intense rate. And they did have immediate, and we are still seeing the impacts of these cuts of US aid and the dismantling of US aid on the ground. I have a number of examples that I can share over the course of our discussion, but one that I think is really interesting and important is one from one of our member organizations, Oxfam Canada. Oxfam Canada does a lot of work on global health and supporting women on sexual and reproductive health and rights. And they found in Malawi, for example, partners that they were working with on the ground in clinics pretty much overnight had to close their doors because they were also reliant on US aid funding. So even though the Canadian funding was continuing, their partners on the ground lost such significant portions of their funding that they really kind of had to shut down and close the doors, leaving many, many women at risk.
Well, many Canadian international development projects depend, as you say, directly or indirectly on USAID-funded multilateral structures. What are the complexities for Canadian organizations when those funding streams are frozen or dismantled or cut, and how are they managing them?
Well, I think it's really interesting to think of the global humanitarian system as a system where a number of different types of organizations, types of funding streams, types of institutions contribute to that system. Now, US aid and US funding was a considerable portion of that global humanitarian system. So when you take in such an abrupt way such significant funding for that system, in some places, the system really verges on collapse. A couple of really interesting examples that I think can illustrate this. One of Cooperation Canada's members, Save the Children Canada, was doing really important work with undernourished and malnourished children in Sudan. And we're working in close partnership with UNICEF. As UNICEF lost their money, those clinics had to close or that they had to reduce significantly their capacity. Another example from one of our members, World Vision Canada. World Vision Canada works closely with the World Food Programme, or the WFP, delivering emergency food aid to people that desperately need it. So what they saw were that their supply chains were really dismantled, really damaged, which meant that they weren't able to participate, engage in those really important life-saving programs as they had been. And, we heard stories of food going bad, rotting in warehouses because of this really significant disruption to the system. So I think when we think about the impact of the USAID cuts, we do need to think about kind of that one institution and kind of what that significant reduction in funding means for the world. But we also need to think of the impact that had on the whole system and the very significant ripple effects that we've been seeing.
Well, Cooperation Canada has called the USAID cuts a threat to the global rules based order. What do you mean by that? And in what way do these funding reductions risk altering how international humanitarian norms are understood or enforced?
Well, I think the way, Mary, that we want to frame this is that the USAID cuts and the dismantling of USAID has come at a time when people are turning their backs on the global rules-based order, global or international humanitarian law, the kind of world and rules of the game as we knew it. So we've seen kind of this rise of authoritarianism, of anti-human rights movements, governments turning their back on democracy, rising polarization, all of these really concerning trends happening at a time when USAID significantly reduced and then was dismantled in terms of funding. So I think that's what we're really getting at here. We're at a time of really significant global disruption. And I think the dismantling of USAID is in some ways kind of a really concrete illustration of this disruption of the global norms, of the global rules-based order, of the rules of the game as we've known it, as we see kind of many countries, but the USA really significantly retreating, stepping back, turning its back on the world rather than engaging.
Well, I want to lean into the impacts of that with the USAID cuts. Really are you're describing them as parts of the aid architecture actually faltering, and I'm curious how Cooperation Canada and its member NGOs are rethinking supply chain resilience and local partnerships, or reaching out to new partnerships or new countries to work with, or even localized strategies in light of these disruptions. What are you seeing on the ground?
Well, I think it's really important to recognize that, like any system, the global aid system needs to modernize and evolve and change. And we see that across any system. We see that across our healthcare system here in Canada, around education, around defense. Systems need to evolve and modernize and change. And prior to these USAID cuts, the global aid system and many of us who are part of it, including Cooperation Canada and our members, were thinking really hard about how do we need to modernize, how do we need to evolve, and how do we need to change. And a really important part of that agenda is something that we call localization, locally led development. In many contexts, we call it shifting power from the global north to the global majority. And a lot of this work was already in place, and we were leaning into this work prior to the USAID cuts. These cuts are pushing us to make those changes even faster. And I think that the cuts have been significant. I have been highly critical about, as I said, the abrupt way that the US made these cuts to aid. But I do now think in this situation we find ourselves in, we need to see this as an opportunity to transform, to change, to shift resources and power to those communities, those people, those organizations, those civil society actors that are really on the front lines of those challenges, but are also on the front lines of driving change. So there is an opportunity for us to really transform the way that we move resources, the way that we shift power, as we say, to those that are really on the front lines. I also think this is an opportunity for us to rethink the global humanitarian and global multilateral system. This is also something that we have been talking about for quite some time. I and Cooperation Canada strongly believe in the importance of a multilateral system, but that system also needs to modernize and evolve and transform. And I think be more nimble, more problem and solution focused, with more kind of creative and flexible coalitions rather than kind of very heavy, cumbersome bureaucracies. So while we should not underestimate the catastrophic impact of the rapid dismantling of US aid, we now need to think, what does this mean for the transformation, and how can we evolve as a global aid system to really be more fit for purpose in this moment and also into the future?
I'm hearing, I hope you'll forgive me by saying, I'm hearing echoes of what we've heard our prime minister talk about in terms of changing the system of trade that we have and looking to new partnerships and being more nimble. It seems, I'm not suggesting you're echoing what he's saying, but simply that it seems like we've been I guess, confronted with a moment that Canada has to look for different ways of doing things and rethink all of our relationships, whether they're from trade or for international aid and international contributions. I'm curious, do you recognize that as sort of a feeling that you're experiencing in terms of addressing these challenges?
Absolutely, Mary. I think our Prime Minister has been clear on what his priorities are for our country, and what some of his priorities are from a foreign policy perspective, and that is around strengthening economic ties, trade relationships, and diversifying our partnerships as a country. And what we have been arguing for a really long time is that international cooperation, international assistance is a really important tool in our toolbox. We kind of think of it as a table, and you have defense, you have trade, you have diplomacy, but you also have development. And it's really important that we continue to invest in the development pillar of our foreign policy table. And it is a very powerful, I think, very powerful tool for us as we seek to build alliances, build partnerships, strengthen a diversified set of partnerships across the country. We know that there are huge trading opportunities for Canadian companies, for Canadian firms, for Canadian innovators in the developing world, in the global majority of our world. And I think investing in development is one way that we can really leverage some of the strength of those markets and those partnerships. Now, I do think it's really important that while we can look at international assistance and international cooperation as being something that we want to have aligned with our foreign policy posture and our foreign policy vision, that the focus of overseas development assistance really should be on poverty reduction, and that should really be at its core. So we have to be careful that we don't kind of retreat or return to an era or to conversations where we're being extremely explicit that, for example, our aid needs to be directly tied to benefiting Canadian businesses or Canadian companies. But there are certainly ways which we can ensure that our development program is coherent with the other pillars and the other aspects of our foreign policy.
Well, Cooperation Canada has urged Canada, the federal government, to step up and fill the gaps. I'm assuming you're talking about the federal government in that regard, and not just donors, but I'm sure you'd include the donors as well. But in practical terms, what would you advise Ottawa to do in the upcoming federal budgets to mitigate harm from the US aid cuts? Are there specific types of programs or geographies you believe should be prioritized?
Yeah, that's a really important question, and I think it's really important for us to be clear and for us to understand and acknowledge publicly that our country is kind of facing in many ways a number of different crises, and we we do not. We absolutely acknowledge that as a sector of organizations that work in international assistance. So that context is really important for us to be sensitive to, and for us to acknowledge and understand. At the same time, the Prime Minister during the election period did say and did make a commitment that he will not cut aid. And what we are seeking to hold him to account for is that commitment. We do not expect Canada to fill the gaps left by US aid. Let us be clear. But we as a country can do our part. And we can make contributions. We can continue to look outwards rather than retreating inwards. And one of the ways that we can do that is for him to keep his promise to maintain the international aid budget in the upcoming budget. When you talk about areas we should think about and look at, of course, we are talking to a number of different officials and leaders about this pivot and this foreign policy pivot that our country is undergoing to be building economic and trade ties. And there are plenty of really fantastic examples of how you can do development in ways that support economic empowerment, trade diversification, trade relationships. So there is a whole kind of portfolio of work that I think can be explored there. Another area is that Canada has been investing significantly for decades in global health and in gender equality, and we are recognized as an absolute global leader. So our message in that space is this is actually where we do have a comparative advantage in terms of expertise within the government, within universities, within the private sector, within civil society. So let's kind of make sure that we don't turn our back on that important expertise that we can engage and contribute through partnerships in the world. Two other really brief points on this, Mary. It's not just about the aid budget, even though that's critical. There are other things that the Canadian government can do that would have a huge impact on the issues that we care about. One of those is around looking at the international financial system and extremely unfair debt structures that countries in the developing or global majority world are facing that make it virtually impossible for them to invest in public services. Another space is around human rights. And when we look around the world, we have global human rights under attack. So there are two areas where we can use our convening power, where we can use our value-based approach to diplomacy to really make a difference beyond just the nuts and bolts of the numbers of the aid budget.
And I'm curious, we've talked about looking outward, and I guess I'm also curious about what ripple effects you perhaps foresee back in Canada as a result of the US aid cuts. For example, increased migration, disease outbreaks, or global instability that could impact Canada. And I'm curious how Canadian domestic security or public health or economic interest could actually be affected by this one very significant cut to international aid by the US government.
Well, I think we've spoken a lot about the economic dimensions of this, and development and international assistance does play a role in supporting governments to provide services to build infrastructure that enables an enabling environment for trade and economic activity and opportunity. So that is definitely an area where we may see an impact. The others, I think, the other point really interestingly is US aid investments provided support to global infrastructure around global health monitoring, around pandemic monitoring, around climate and weather monitoring. So without that sort of infrastructure in place, that is quite concerning for us as a country, as we face and have just experienced in our very recent history a global pandemic, as we are feeling the direct impacts in our country, whether it's through wildfires, what's happening in the north and the Arctic. So that I think will have quite a direct impact for us as Canada. But I think there's a broader point here, which is Canada is a very globally connected economy, country, population. And stability in the world is good for Canada. There's very compelling research that shows that $1 invested in conflict prevention can save $60 in military intervention down the road. So those sorts of investments, I think, are really, really important. And it's in our interest. It's good for Canada. It's not only the right thing to do, but it's the smart thing for us to do. It's good for Canada to be engaging in and supporting a more stable world.
Now, you've spoken out about concerns over foreign aid being cut in Canadian political platforms previously, and we just discussed what your expectations are in the upcoming budget that will be brought down by Mark Carney's government. How do you think shifts in Canadian politics might either exacerbate or mitigate the impacts of US aid cuts globally?
Well, our job as Canadian organisations who care about international cooperation, who care about international assistance, is to ensure that Canadians, Canadian communities, Canadian kids, but also Canadian politicians understand the impact that this work has around the world. So we are absolutely nonpartisan in the way that we engage on these issues. We engage with politicians and elected officials across the range of the political spectrum, across many political parties. And it's really our job to demonstrate that this is a good investment for Canada. This is a sound investment for Canada, and that this aligns with our objectives as a country around prosperity, around security, around human rights, around democracy. So that's the hard work that we need to do. We continue to have conversations across the aisle with elected officials to ensure that they really understand and see the value of this investment. It's about 2 cents on every dollar, our investment in international assistance. So it's a relatively small contribution that has a really significant impact.
And public opinion can shift rapidly when crises worsen. How is Cooperation Canada engaging the Canadian public or via the media in accountability for these cuts, ensuring that stories from impacted communities are heard and that there is pressure on policymakers to act and to maintain their international support?
Well, we do that in a range of ways. When these US aid cuts and the dismantling of US aid was announced, me and many of our colleagues did everything we could to speak out publicly using all the communications channels at our disposal, including absolutely the media, and in really trying to call and shine a light on the impacts that these US aid cuts would have. So I think really consistent engagement with the media through including conversations like this one, Mary, are really, really important. And my colleagues and peers and I have really been seeking to do that. We have also been really seeking to amplify and lift up the voices of those that are most affected. So many of our members work with many organizations and partners around the world that have been affected, and we have been really seeking to elevate and amplify and ensure that Canadians are hearing stories of that impact. It's our job to, as I said, also engage with Canadians. Millions of Canadians engage in our work every day, whether it's through donating, whether it's through advocating, whether it's through volunteering, whether it's through learning. And so really ensuring that we maintain that connection with Canadian communities around not only the impacts of the US aid cuts, but I think even more significantly, the value of Canada engaging in international assistance and international cooperation is absolutely key.
And given that foreign aid budgets globally tend to shift with political cycles and changing crises in the world, what would you recommend to alliances of NGOs, philanthropic organizations, and civil society in order to build more robust buffers so vital programs aren't abruptly halted when donors' priorities change or when we see these enormous cuts by such an important player in international aid?
Yeah, well, I think there's a number of things that we're working really, really hard on. I think one of those is really seeking to shift resources to our partners on the ground that are really, as I said, at the front lines of the work that we do, and ensuring that that funding is long term, is sustainable, and is resilient. One of the ways that we can do that is by having coalitions of diverse actors, whether it's some government funding, some philanthropic funding, some funding from Canadian organizations that is supported by the generosity of Canadians, the private sector, universities, really kind of coming together and identifying a problem and really working hard together to contribute to seeking to solve that. It's really important that the communities and the expertise and the people that are at the heart of our work are at the heart of the design and the delivery of the work that we do. So I think that is something we really need to continue to lean into. One of the challenges that we do have around this work is the bureaucracy and red tape associated with it. Do not get me wrong, the importance of accountability of this work is absolutely crucial. And I would argue the international assistance or international aid sector in Canada is one of the most highly monitored and audited in our country. So we take that accountability extremely seriously. At the same time, we all want efficiency and we all want impact. So ensuring that we're cutting some of that red tape and ensuring that we're able to move resources where they're most needed is really, really important.
And looking ahead, if USAID isn't somehow resuscitated or something like it doesn't emerge to replace it, what are some of the new models of international cooperation or funding architecture? For example, more direct funding to local actors or pooled funding that Cooperation Canada believes could possibly better withstand this kind of geopolitical volatility?
Well, look, I think more diverse partnerships is really important, and this is diversity in terms of the types of funding sources, but also the types of partners. And so, as I've said, ensuring we're engaging not only Canadian but global civil society, universities, governments, the private sector, I think is a really exciting and a really promising way of us all working. I think we also need to be much more problem and solution oriented in the way that we do our work and be really open and have this sort of flexibility and imagination and creativity to identify a problem, bring the right actors together to kind of raise resources, engage in advocacy, and drive the change to address those problems. And those coalitions of actors will be different for the different types of problems that we're trying to solve, or the different types of opportunities that we want to leverage. So I think kind of cutting back some of the bureaucracy and red tape and supporting experimentation and flexibility and nimbleness is really, really important. I think the final thing I would say is, while all of these kind of new or imaginative and creative ways of us thinking about how we deliver and engage in international assistance is absolutely critical, let's not forget the broader context within which these programs are operating. And so that is why things like addressing deep inequality in the international financial architecture is so important. That is why ensuring that Canada holds the line on human rights and democracy is important. So these broader contextual issues that have such significant and direct impacts on people's lives are really important policy conversations, and they're really important policy spaces where Canada has a lot to contribute and where we will continue to push the Canadian government to engage in.
Well, thank you, Kate, for sharing your insights with Canadian nonprofit professionals and Canadians at large. And thank you for the extraordinarily important work that you do at Cooperation Canada, and also all of your member organizations do globally. It's really so very admirable, and we want to give voice to the important work that you're doing in the hope that you prevail with delivering on your missions. And thank you for finding time in your very busy schedule to join us on Charity Village Connects.
Thank you so much, Mary. It was really a pleasure. Thanks for the invitation.